All right, so we're in chapter 2 and Mishnah 7. We sort of finished in the middle of that Mishnah where Hillel is saying, he's giving a whole list of these things that, on the surface seem desirable, but they just multiply tsaras for people, right? You have the more flesh, the more worms, the more real estate, the more worry, the more wives you have, the more witchcraft. The more female slaves you have, the more lewdness. The more male slaves you have, the more theft you have, right? Marbe Avadi, Marbe Gezel. And this is probably actually true, right? Because, a slave or an indentured servant, however you want to define it, has no real interest in looking out for its master's welfare. But, it occurred to me, as we're seeing currently in our society, right, that there are a lot of people who have an assumption that, everybody who works for the government is, a crook, lazy, unnecessary, whatever. And, next year when everybody gets the flu, we'll see whether that's the case or not, but there is a certain cynicism in Hillel's statement here that is maybe not that different than the cynicism that is rampant in our society right now. But for Hillel, there's also a flip side. Okay. So I'm gonna pick up right here. Marbe Torah, Marbe Hayim. Okay, the more Torah, the more life. Marbe Yeshiva, Marbe Chochmah. All right, the word yeshiva literally means sitting. Okay, now we also know this word as what? Yeshiva, right? A yeshiva is a school, a place where you go to learn Torah, right? But the word yeshiva literally means sitting, right? So a yeshiva is a place where you sit. What do? You sit and you learn Torah, right? And so the more sitting, the more wisdom. Marbe Eitzah, Marbe Tfuna, the more counsel, the more advice you take, the more understanding, or the more understanding. Marbe tzedakah, marbe shalom, the more charity, the more tzedakah, the more peace, right? So our translation says charity, and it's not a bad translation, right? But it's not really a good translation either, right? Because what's the difference between tzedakah and charity? Right? This is not merely related to this Mishnah. This is like in general, in terms of a view of how we live our lives as Jews. What's the difference between tzedakah and charity?
Doesn't tzedakah go to righteousness?
Right. I mean, the word tzedek,
Correct. Is
right, means justice or righteousness. All right. Charity, like, certainly it's good to give charity, right? I mean, but caritas, charity comes from the Latin word caritas, right, which is about a feeling, right? If you want to give charity, that's great, right? But if you don't want to give charity, you haven't committed a sin, right? But tzedakah, first of all, it's not it's all right. So let me ask this. So the fact that we call it tzedakah, what does that tell us about it?
Is it giving of yourself of good deeds more than just things? Money?
Well, it can be. I mean, right. Tzedakah doesn't have to be monetary, right? That is certainly true. I mean, there are other types of tzedakah. I mean, if you have like, I mean, this is much later. It's 800 years or 1,000 years later. But if you know Maimonides' ladder of tzedakah,
Mhm.
right? That the highest level of tzedakah is helping another person to attain self-sufficiency, right? So that they aren't dependent, and so like, I mean, Judaism is neither conservative nor liberal. It's both and it's neither, right? I mean, but the idea is that it's better to help somebody become self-sufficient than to constantly be supporting them from the public trough, right? Um, but the point is, first of all, it's not optional, it's obligatory. And the second is that the Torah desires a society that where wealth inequality is minimized, right? That, I mean, you have all kinds of legislation, right? Like the cancellation of loans in the sabbatical year, right? The idea that in the Jubilee year, land that was alienated goes back to the original owner, et cetera, right? The Torah recognizes that there's going to be inequality, but does not view that as desirable and wants that inequality to be minimized as much as possible, right? So that tzedakah, therefore, in a way, really belongs to the recipient, right? If you have, a certain amount of resources and you don't give them to the needy, you, in essence, have stolen from the needy, right? I mean, I mean, I know that I can get political, but I don't think the God of the Torah has a very favorable view of the fact that the House just passed a budget that's going to give $4.5 trillion extra dollars to the wealthy and take away $2 trillion from the needy, right? And then these people call themselves religious Christians, right? they flunked Bible 101. There's no question about it, right? And the Torah wants a society where there's more equality. At the same time, the Torah wants a society where people work for what they have, right? I mean, brings us back to Maimonides' highest level of tzedakah, right? That you assist people by helping them to become self-sufficient, but you don't help them to become self-sufficient by denying them healthcare, by denying them education, right? So, you know, and right, so the more charity, the more peace, right? And we heard this, right, 4 years ago, right? Or 5 years ago, right? After George Floyd. But we hear it from, right? No justice, no peace, right? And I mean, so Marbe tzedakah, Marbe shalom, right? So if you said ein tzedakah, ein shalom, right? So if there's no charity, there's no peace. Right, but if you want to say no justice, no peace, you say ein tzedek, ein shalom, right? That the two words are very, very similar, right? And we attain a peaceful society by having more equality, not more inequality. Okay. Kana shem tov, kana la'atzmo. If you have acquired a good name, you have acquired something for yourself. Kanalo divrei Torah, kanalo chaye holam haba. But if he has acquired knowledge of Torah, he has acquired life in the world to come. All right, so like a good name, that's important and it's real. But it's temporal. Right? Knowledge of Torah, you've acquired something that has value, not only in this world, but in the world to come. All right. Any comments, questions, thoughts on what we just read?
And what does knowledge mean? Does it mean deep understanding? Does it mean living according
Well,
to
it says
Torah values?
divrei Torah. Right, it's a good question. Divrei Torah literally means words of Torah. Right. So that's a good question. I mean, in one of the Mishnayot that is, not too far ahead. I mean, I don't know if we'll get there tonight, but we'll get there eventually, right? It deals with the different types of Torah learning, right? I mean, basically, well, I mean, there's broad learning and there's deep learning, right? I mean, and, I generally, when I'm teaching, prefer depth rather than breadth, right? Although in this course, it's really almost the opposite. Well, I don't know what to say it's the opposite, right? But we're not studying a lot of material, right? And even in yeshiva, right? There's bikiut and there's iyun, right? There are two different methods. Like, we want to study something really, really, really in depth, and if we don't cover a lot of material, that's great. And then there's the opposite, bikiut, where we cover a lot of material, and it depends almost on what the purpose is, right? I mean, if you're really training to be a pulpit rabbi, you need to know a little bit about everything, right? You don't necessarily need like PhD level learning about anything, but you need to know a little bit about everything, right? I mean, I would say the two most important things are knowing that you don't know and knowing how to find out, right? Because if you don't know that you don't know, then you're really, can get yourself and others into trouble, right? But there's a difference between being like a rabbi of a community versus being like, an academic or a posek, somebody who writes responsa or whatever. So that's a good question, but I don't know the answer because it just says divrei Torah. So I think any Torah learning is a good thing, right? All right. Anybody else? Okay. So now we'll go on to Mishnah 8. Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai Kibel mi Hillel umi Shammai. All right. So Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai received the oral tradition from Hillel and Shammai. All right. And if you notice, Hillel and Shammai are just Hillel and Shammai. They don't have a title. Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai, not Rabbi or Rab, but Rabban. Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai. Rabban means he's the head of the Sanhedrin. Okay, so now we're getting into a more sort of formalized and hierarchical system. So he was the generation after Hillel and Shammai. And this is important. So I'm going to ask, and I'll answer my own question if you don't know, but what do you know about Yochanan ben Zakkai? Anybody know anything about him? Okay, so you probably heard this story, but you don't necessarily recall that it's connected to Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai. But so he was in Jerusalem in 70 CE, when the Romans were besieging Jerusalem and about to get through the gates, tear down the walls, and conquer it. And so it was a siege. So nobody was let in and out, except that if somebody died, the Romans would let a handful of people take that person out in a coffin to be buried. Okay, and Yochanan ben Zakkai saw the Romans are going to capture Jerusalem. They're going to destroy the temple. Fighting against them is useless. So he was alive, but his disciples put him in a coffin to bring him out of the city, claiming that he was dead. Okay, and they brought him to the Roman general Vespasian, and he got out of the coffin and he said to him, "Hail Caesar." And Vespasian, "What are you talking about?" And Yochanan ben Zakkai said, "I received a vision that the emperor is going to die and you're going to be named the next emperor. And just then a messenger came from Rome. The emperor has died. You, Vespasian, are the new emperor." So Vespasian says to Yochanan ben Zakkai, "Okay, what do you want? What can I give you?" And he says, "Ten li yavne v'chachamecha." give me Yavna and its sages. Okay, Yavna today it's a city on the coast south of Tel Aviv, and Vespasian allowed Yochanan ben Zakkai to move the Sanhedrin from Jerusalem to Yavna. Okay, so that was around 70 CE, and 130 years later, Yehuda Hanasi, who's in Yavna still, because that's where the Sanhedrin still is, and they codify the Mishnah, right? So this is Yochanan ben Zakkai, right? So let me stop. I mean, what is the significance of this story? What's the significance of this story?
Well, I think that whoever the person that Yochanan ben Zakkai said was going to be the next ruler was probably thought he had special powers, or
Sure.
he was really somebody outstanding, and or else he wouldn't have asked him what he wanted.
Right, but what do you think of his answer?
Well, he wanted to save the Jews and be reestablished in, I'm assuming, a much safer place.
Right. So, but I mean, the point is, well, I don't want to push you too much, okay? But anybody else? All right, so I will push you, Toby, with your permission. Right, so he wanted to save the Jews, and how did he save the Jews? Right, or what saves the Jews? In other words, he could have said, take your soldiers and go back to Rome, right? But he didn't say that. He said, let me set up a school in Yavna.
Oh.
Right. In other words,
He was looking to the future, I guess, and hoping that would be the way to save the Jews and not try to antagonize the Romans.
exactly, right? Like he was pragmatic, first of all, right?
Right.
And I mean, from his perspective, what saves the Jews is the ability to teach and study Torah, right? It's not political independence from Rome, right? Now, maybe he knows that I could ask him for that and I'm never going to get it, right? So why ask for something that I'm never going to get? And then I've blown it entirely, right? I'll ask for something that maybe I'll get, right? But he's pragmatic. And indeed, he does save the Jews, right? Because if Yochanan hadn't set up this academy in Yavna, there'd be no Judaism, right? Because because that's what kept us alive, was the codification of the Mishnah, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So in that sense, he was a very, very pragmatic person, right? And he set the wave of the future. And for me, I mean, I think Yochanan ben Zakkai is a hero, right? But there are people who, oh hakol o lo klum, right? Everything or nothing. And then there are people who are like, pragmatic, right? I'm going to ask for something I think I can get, and I'll do the best that I can with that, right? So, Yochanan ben Zakkai, and he would, I'm sure that the people who stayed behind in Jerusalem and continued to fight the Romans thought that he was a traitor, right? But in the end, he's the one who actually saved. I don't know if he saved the Jews, but he saved Judaism. All right. Yeah. Anybody else? Yeah, Sue.
Do we know if that story is true, or is it, just kind of handed down and not based on facts? Or I wonder, did anybody else write about it?
There's no source outside of the Talmud for this story. Okay. I mean, here's what we do know. Okay. I mean, that the outlines of it are correct. I mean, we know Yochanan ben Zakkai established the academy at Yavna, right? That we know, fact. We know Vespasian was the commander of the Roman forces besieging Jerusalem, fact. We know he was recalled from Jerusalem to become the new emperor, fact. I think it's quite unlikely that Yochanan ben Zakkai would have been able to set up the academy at Yavna without Roman permission. Okay, fact. What becomes less established fact is, did that encounter between Yochanan ben Zakkai and Vespasian occur, and is that the reason they were allowed to set up the academy? That there's no attestation outside of rabbinic legend. Okay, and here I think, I mean, you have a good question on two accounts. One is that, right, we don't know something is a historical fact unless it's attested by, let's say, two independent sources, right? And beyond that, look, at this point, the rabbis are saying, look, right, because by the time of the codification of the Mishnah, there have been two unsuccessful revolts against Rome. There's the one in 70, and then there's the Bar Kokhba rebellion 130, 135, right? And the Mishnah is not codified until 200, right? And that's why, the focus of Hanukkah shifts from the victory of the Maccabees to the miracle of the oil, right? Because the rabbi's message is, we don't need another revolt against Rome, right? We need to learn Torah and live by the mitzvot, right? So, yeah, I mean, I mean, despite the certain things that we know are facts, right? This story could be concocted out of whole cloth to reinforce this idea of not rebelling against Rome. Absolutely. Yeah. Anybody else? All right, so we'll go on. All right, so this is Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai. Hu haya omer im lamadete Torah harbe al tachzik tova la'atzmecha ki lechach notzarta. All right, he would say, if you learned a lot of Torah, don't give yourself a lot of credit. Okay, let's see what the translation is. If you've learned much Torah, do not claim credit for yourself, because for such a purpose were you created. Right? I mean, all right. So you learned a lot of Torah. Great, Mazel Tov. Right? That's what God created you to learn Torah. Right? It's not like a special. It's not like a special thing. It reminds me, I don't know where I read this, but a scene in a short story or a novel, I honestly don't recall where I read this. It was a long time ago. But the guy was writing about the dinner table at his parents' home, his parents being, Eastern European Jewish ingredients. And, mom would make dinner and she'd ask dad, is it good? And he'd say, yeah, it's good. And then she'd be like disappointed that he didn't praise her cooking. And he said, it's supposed to be good. I mean, you claim credit. Yeah, the food is good. It's supposed to be good, right? And right, so I learned a lot of Torah, God, right? So, pat me on the head. And God says, fine, you learned a lot of Torah, right? You're supposed to learn a lot of Torah. That's why I created you, right? So, all right, any comments or questions on that? But it just reminded me, and you're all laughing, right? But you can see kind of like that personality characteristic, right? That probably your parents or grandparents had, right? It's supposed to be good. Right? All right. Any comments or questions? Yeah, Sue.
I wonder, every time there is somebody that gets in the news that is creating a Ponzi scheme or robbing from people, and you get the feeling, oh my gosh, it's going to reflect badly on all of us Jews, And so I wonder, do you think there's too much emphasis on learning and not enough emphasis on putting this into action? Like even the kids in Hebrew school today, are they learning, what they should do in daily practice as far as ethics? And people that are in the yeshivas and they're studying, all of this, like sometimes I feel like putting it into practice has kind of been lost, or maybe not emphasized as much. I don't know. What do you think about it?
I mean, look, that's a good question. I mean, I think, look, learning Torah the whole purpose of Torah, what's the purpose of Torah? What is the purpose of Judaism? Right? And I think there are different answers to that question, right? I mean, one answer would be to do God's will, right? I don't think most non-Orthodox Jews would find that a satisfactory answer, to do God's will, right? I mean, in theory, within Orthodoxy, that should be the only answer. But I don't know how many Orthodox Jews find that a credible answer either, right? another answer would be to perpetuate Judaism. Like, in other words, Judaism has no purpose other than to perpetuate itself, right? And then my answer would be to teach us how to be a mensch, to teach us how to be a decent human being, right? And to create a society that is a decent society. I mean, I can tell you, look, I can't speak for what's going on generally, right? I mean, frankly, the more I read about studies either of the college campus or congregational religious schools, the more I realize that, you know, I am far closer to the end of my career than I am to the beginning of my career, right? And that, um, I will say that when we still had our own Hebrew school, right, and we did the Shalom learning curriculum, and that's based on Jewish values, okay? It is not based on like a discrete history class and a Bible heroes class and a holidays class. It's a curriculum that's based on values. Okay, so I do think, look, how successful that curriculum will prove to be, I can't answer. I mean, first of all, it's too new, and there haven't been longitudinal studies, right? But look, and I think if you look at the curriculum of JDS, right? I mean, it is also, I mean, the importance of midot, of character traits, is really important, okay? But whether that is the case in the Orthodox, I can't answer that, right? A, because I don't know, and B, because I want to be fair, right? I mean, you'd have to ask people who are internal to that world, right? I mean, so I can't, I mean, certainly, look, there are crooks within the Orthodox world. Would those people still be crooks if they weren't Orthodox? I'm sure they were. There's a certain percentage of people who that's just their personality, right? Okay. I mean, I will say that within the ultra-Orthodox world, there's tremendous chesed or tremendous tzedakah, but I think it is directed only inward to within the Jewish community by and large. And I'll tell you what I mean. Okay, so, right, chesed means like loving kindness, okay? And so in almost every hospital in New York, there's a Bikur Cholim room. Bikur Cholim means visiting the sick, right? But it means more than that. It's taking care of sick people and their families, okay? So when my mom was dying of cancer and she was in a hospital called Calvary Hospital, which is in the Bronx, which is a specialized, it's a hospice that's licensed as a hospital. Okay, that means that certain things that would otherwise not be taken care of, Medicare takes care of because the place is licensed as a hospital. Okay, and Calvary, you could tell by its name, this is not a Jewish institution, right? But it's in the Bronx, and there are a lot of Jewish patients, and there's a Jewish chaplain. They're full-time Haredi Orthodox Jew, and there's this Bikur Holim room, okay, which is funded by and stocked by the Satmar Hasidim, who are like, they are the strictest of the strict and the most anti-Zionist, and the ones who have, the least desire to have any interaction with other Jews, whatever. And this room, and my mom was in the hospital over Passover, okay? And this room was stocked with every kosher for Passover food imaginable, right? And the rabbi there, told me, because I was there during Chol Moed, and he knew I was coming back to Washington, and he said, take food with you, right? You got to eat while you're on the road, and you're probably going to get home and you're going to be tired and haven't had time to just take whatever you want, right? And I mean, they're really a tremendous chesed, right? But the only people who would be taking advantage of that would be Jews, right? So that, like, there's a lock on the door, it's a number, and they put the code, but they put the code in Hebrew, right? So let's say the code is 1212, right? So they put on the door Aleph Bet, right? So, I mean, it's tremendous chesed, right? And I suppose technically anybody could go in and take advantage of the room, but realistically only Jews would, right? And in fact, not only Jews, but only Jews who have enough Jewish knowledge to know that Aleph Bet means 1212, and that would be the code for the room, right? So there's a lot of good in that community, a lot of good, but it's only focused towards other Jews. It's not focused out towards the world as a whole. So, I mean, and I think that's a fair statement. I mean, whether you consider that a critique or simply an objective statement that's neither, praise nor critique, I suppose depends on your worldview. All right, again, any questions or comments, thoughts on what I just said? All right, so we'll move on. Okay, I'm just gonna, because it's a long Mishnah, so I'm just gonna look at the English translation. Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai had 5 disciples, and they were these: Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanos, Rabbi Joshua ben Hananiah, Rabbi Yosei the priest, HaKohen, Rabbi Shimon ben Netanel, and Rabbi Eliezer ben Arach. Rabban Yochanan used to list their outstanding virtues. Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanos is a plastered cistern which loses not a drop. What does that mean? I mean, that's a great statement, but what does that mean? A plastered cistern which loses not a drop.
A cistern is the way you gather water in an
Right.
area where you don't, well, you could also get it from You could get it from a stream or something. But when it rains, you get water in the cistern. And they're saying that his mind is so adept that he doesn't lose a drop. Anything that comes in, he keeps it.
Right. Total recall. Right. Right. And it's plastered. Right. So a cistern. I mean, I've never lived in a house with a cistern, but I know enough about archaeology, right? That a plastered cistern, as opposed, right? A cistern, it's made out of stone, but if it's plastered, it's going to retain the water more than one that's simply stone, because if it's simply stone, water could seep out through the cracks, if it's underground into the dirt or whatever. So you plaster it, right? So everything that he learns, everything that he hears, he retains. He has total recall, right? Now, is this good or bad?
I think Warren Buffett has that same, what do they call it? Idel or whatever. It means a photographic memory.
Eidetic, yeah.
Yeah, eidetic. Thank you. But the fact is that it's probably a mark of genius, really, in many ways.
Right.
I think
but it's also, I mean, it's total recall, but it doesn't say anything about his own creativity, right? I mean, in other words,
Does he share that knowledge?
what?
Does he share that knowledge?
Well, presumably, but what I'm saying is he's passing on what he learned from others, right? But is he actually increasing understanding, right? In other words, like I had, I taught college. I taught in a couple of different colleges, right? And you have, a certain, like I remember I would start my first class every semester. I would say to my students, and maybe this is why I don't teach college anymore, you have been trained to think that your job is to repeat back to me what I have told you. Right? And if you take a test, you take a midterm, you take a final, and you accurately repeat back what I told you, you think if you can do that, you should get an A. I think if you can do that, you should get a C. Right? But I'm nice, so I'll give you a B. Right? But if you want to get an A, you have to do more than simply accurately spit back to me what I told you. Right? You have to develop it. Right? You have to develop it. And so Rabbi Eliezer, there's no indication that he's developing anything. He's absolutely recalling with 100% accuracy and passing that on, but he's not adding to the knowledge. He's simply preserving what he retained.
He's an archivist.
He's an archivist. Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
But the law is the first thing you have to know. Get it from some source of your own mind. You need all this basic knowledge, all these basic principles, and the facts of the case you're in. But then, for law school, what you need to do in the practice of law, you need to be able to apply facts to law that's favorable to you, and if it's not favorable, figure out what else you can do.
Right. So what Rabbi Elliott, what Eliezer it's not bad. It's a necessary thing, but it's necessary, but it's not sufficient. Right? I mean, we're never going to have any development if all you're doing is accurately passing on what you received. Right? You have to accurately pass on what you received and then develop it further. Right? Now, absolutely, within rabbinic society, accuracy in attribution is a basic principle, right? But it's not sufficient. Okay. Rabbi Joshua ben Hananiah, happy is the woman that gave birth to him. Okay, so he's great, but we don't really know anything about that, right? Rabbi Yossi, the priest, is a pious man. Rabbi Shimon ben Netanel is one that fears sin. And Rabbi Eliezer ben Arach is like a spring that ever gathers force. Ma'ayan hamit gaber. Okay, so what does that say? A spring that ever gathers force, right? I mean, you compare that to a cistern, right, that doesn't ever lose a drop, right? So I read that as, right, because Torah is what? Torah is analogized to water, right? Right? Torah is called Mayim Chaim, right? Agua viva, right? Fuente de agua viva, the fountain of living water, right? What is Torah is living water, or the water of life, right? I mean, they got that from us, right? And so, a cistern is great, but an ever gushing spring is even better, right? Because you're developing it, you're not just preserving it, right? Okay, so Rabbi Yochanan used to say, if all the sages of Israel were on one scale of the balance, and Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus on the other scale, he would outweigh them all, right? So, right, everybody on one scale, Eliezer, the cistern that never loses a drop, on the other, he outweighs them all, right? And then Abba Shaul said in his name, meaning in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, if all the sages of Israel are on one scale of the balance and Rabbi Eliezer also with them, but Rabbi Elazar ben Arach on the other scale, the spring that gathers force, right? So all the sages and Eliezer ben Hyrcanus outweighs them all. But now we take Eliezer ben Hyrcanus and we put him with everybody else, but then Eliezer ben Arach on the other scale, he would outweigh them all, right? Meaning what? It's not enough, right? I mean, if you can, so my theoretical B student who thinks she deserves an A because she accurately regurgitated everything that I said, right? That's great. It's important. It is important to know what you were taught and be able to accurately transmit it, understand it, etc. But to be really outstanding, you have to do more than that, right? You have to not only transmit knowledge, but advance it, right? And that's true in any field, right? I mean, it's true in Torah, but it's also true in secular law. It's true in any field of endeavor, right? I mean, if you're a physician, you have to know what you were taught, right? But medicine doesn't advance simply by virtue of the doctors accurately knowing what they were taught, right? They have to advance medicine, right? And if they want to advance medicine, then we need a Secretary of Health and Human Services. She goes, no! And then we can all die of the flu next year and we don't have anything to worry about anymore. Right? And none of us have to worry about, our 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 retirement funds running out before we die. We'll all just die of the flu.
I think it's interesting that each disciple has a distinguishing characteristic.
Sure.
And it as though none of them had some of the virtues of the others. And so then when you line them up and you put them on the scale, it makes for, kind of it's an interesting story device, I think, to weigh the respective virtues of everyone.
Yeah, I mean, but if you think about it, right? I mean, he's got 5 disciples.
Right.
Right? So, 5, right? So you need your point guard, right? And you need your shooting guard, right? And your tall forward and your center and your swing, right? I mean, and that, if you've got 5 centers, you don't have a basketball team, right? If you've got 5 point guards, you don't have a basketball team, right? There are roles to be played, right? So so absolutely, right? There are roles to be played, and if you don't fill each of those roles, right, then you don't have a team, right? And then we don't have Judas. And interestingly, I just say this, I mean, these rabbis, I mean, you've read stories from the Talmud with these rabbis, okay? Like the story of, that story of not in heaven, right? And where, and Rabbi Eliezer ben Horkonos, he's the one who keeps trying to prove that all the other rabbis are wrong, right? And he's the one who in the end gets excommunicated. All right. So these are like not just random figures. Okay, questions. I apologize, we don't cover a lot of material, but obviously you're here, so you're getting some value out of it.
I don't think there's any point in racing through it, so it's good.
What?
I don't think we want to race through it. I think
No.
Right.
each.
Yeah. Okay. So any last thoughts on tonight's material or whatever? All right. If not, good night. Shabbat shalom.
Thank you.
Chodesh tov. I mean,
Thank you,
beginning
Rabbi.
of Adar, right? It's Misha Nechnas Adar Marbin Besimcha. When Adar comes, we should be happy. It's a mitzvah, so I guess we have to. So go out and be happy despite everything that's happening in the world. Okay, and Shabbat Shalom.
Good night, everybody.
Hello.
Night.